What happens when a 12-year-old boy is forced to live up to a lie? A lie his parents told to protect him from the world's harsh judgments, but one that ultimately shatters his sense of self. Can he prove to himself, not the world, that his worth isn't defined by a test score or anyone else's expectations? Want to see how Leo finds his way out of the lie and into his true potential? Stick around for the twists, the growth, and the lessons that will leave you inspired. Hit that like button, subscribe, and join Leo on this unforgettable journey. The school stood on the outskirts of a quiet town, its weathered brick walls telling stories of countless students who had passed through its halls. The classrooms, once bright and full of potential, had faded over time, but the echoes of laughter, whispers, and scribbling on notebooks still filled the air. The sound of shoes scuffing across the hallway floor and lockers slamming shut was a constant reminder of the bustling life within. Yet, amid the daily chatter, there was an undercurrent of something more, a feeling that something was amiss. There were secrets in the air, subtle tensions, and expectations that weighed heavily on some of the students, especially one quiet boy named Leo Wren. Leo was 12 years old, with messy brown hair that always seemed to fall into his eyes, a few freckles scattered across his face, and glasses that frequently slid down his nose. To most people, Leo appeared like an average student. He was small for his age and often kept to himself, preferring to observe rather than participate. He was curious about the world around him, but when it came to academics, Leo struggled. Math was especially difficult for him, and his grades reflected that. Despite his struggles, Leo was always loved by his parents. His mother and father, both hardworking and successful in their own right, wanted nothing more than to see their son succeed. But beneath their desire for his success lay something else, a deep-rooted fear that Leo would be ridiculed and mocked for his academic shortcomings. Leo's parents believed that if Leo was seen as a genius, no one would dare make fun of him. They wanted him to be special, to be someone who stood out from the crowd. So when Leo struggled in school, they did something drastic. They falsified his IQ test scores. Rather than accepting Leo's real abilities and working with him to improve, they presented a falsified report, claiming that Leo was a genius with extraordinary intelligence. They presented this fabricated score to the school, demanding that he be treated as a gifted student, a prodigy among his peers. They were certain that this would protect Leo from the teasing and bullying that so often came with being different. At first, the school went along with it. Leo's parents had connections and were respected members of the community. The school administrators, eager to avoid conflict, accepted the test scores and placed Leo in a special gifted program. Leo was treated like the brilliant student that his parents wanted him to be, even though his grades did not reflect that status. But there was a problem. Despite his genius label, Leo continued to struggle. In fact, he had a hard time keeping up with even the most basic tasks in class. His math assignments were barely finished, and when he did attempt them, they were full of mistakes. His classmates noticed, but they didn't say anything. They had been told Leo was a genius, so they assumed the issues were just temporary. Mrs. Lydia Grant, Leo's math teacher, had a different view. She was a seasoned teacher in her 40s, known for her tough love approach and high standards. She had little patience for students who didn't take academics seriously. She prided herself on maintaining discipline and ensuring that all her students performed well. When she first heard about Leo's genius status, she was skeptical. She'd seen this happen before, parents with unrealistic expectations, pushing their children into roles they weren't ready for. It didn't take long for Mrs. Grant to notice that Leo's performance was slipping. While other students in the gifted program sailed through the material, Leo struggled to keep up. His math homework was sloppy, and his test scores were dismal. He was often distracted during lessons, doodling in his notebook or staring out the window. Mrs. Grant wasn't fooled by the label on his records. She knew something wasn't right. After several weeks of observing Leo's performance, Mrs. Grant decided to address the issue directly. One afternoon, she called Leo's parents into the school for a meeting. She had a deep concern that couldn't be ignored any longer. "Mr. and Mrs. Wren," Mrs. Grant began, her voice calm but firm. "I've been keeping an eye on Leo's progress, and I have to tell you that his academic performance isn't reflecting the test results we've been given. He's struggling in math, and I think it's important that we address this issue before it gets worse." Leo's parents sat across from Mrs. Grant, looking uncomfortable. They shifted in their seats, their expressions unreadable. "What do you mean by struggling?" Mrs. Wren asked, her voice tight with concern. "Leo is a genius, as his test scores clearly show. He should be excelling." Mrs. Grant's expression softened. "I understand that you believe Leo has exceptional abilities, but the reality in the classroom is different. His work is subpar, and he doesn't engage with the material the way a gifted student should. His grades are not matching the expectations for a student of his supposed intelligence." There was a long pause. Leo's parents exchanged a glance, and Mrs. Grant could see the anxiety in their eyes. She continued, "I'm requesting that Leo's IQ test be rerun. I think it's important to reassess his abilities, as the current results do not match his performance." Leo's father sighed heavily. "We've had the test done once already. It's valid. We're confident that Leo is gifted." Mrs. Grant raised an eyebrow. "With all due respect, the test was taken over a year ago. It's not unusual for test results to be outdated. I believe a rerun is in order to ensure that we're accurately supporting Leo's academic needs." After a few tense moments, Leo's parents reluctantly agreed. They wanted to avoid any further confrontation with the school, and so they signed the papers for a new test to be administered. The wheels were set in motion for a difficult truth to come to light. The reality was that Leo's intelligence wasn't as exceptional as his parents had claimed. And when the new IQ test came back, it confirmed what Mrs. Grant had suspected. Leo's intelligence was average at best, and his academic struggles were more than just a phase. The hum of chatter filled the classroom, but today there was an unusual silence around Leo Wren. His classmates, as usual, were buzzing with energy, but all eyes were on him as Mrs. Grant called him to the front of the room. It was a routine exercise in math. Solve a simple fraction on the board. But for Leo, this was far from routine. He hesitated before standing up, glancing nervously at the board. The chalkboard, usually a place where he felt the pressure of proving himself, seemed to be taunting him today. Leo's heart raced in his chest, and a cold sweat began to form at the back of his neck. His classmates were whispering, and he could feel their eyes on him, expecting him to fail. Leo was a 12-year-old boy who had always been told he was a genius, someone destined for greatness. His parents had gone to great lengths to make sure he was seen as extraordinary, even when his grades and performance didn't reflect that. But the weight of those expectations had started to wear on him. The pressure was suffocating, and today, standing before the class, Leo felt like he was about to crack. Mrs. Grant watched him closely, arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She'd known Leo for months now, and she could see the difference between his supposed genius and his actual performance. It wasn't just about the math. It was about everything. The distractions, the lack of engagement, the uncertainty that clouded his every move. Leo took the chalk from the tray and hesitated again before he began writing. His hand shook slightly as he began to work through the problem. His classmates waited, but as the seconds ticked by, the whispers started to fade into an eerie quiet. Mrs. Grant wasn't surprised when Leo fumbled with the steps. The fraction, which was simple to most students, seemed like a mountain to him. After what felt like an eternity, Leo finally put the chalk down and stepped back, his face flushed with embarrassment. The equation wasn't solved perfectly, and Mrs. Grant knew that. The students exchanged glances, some trying to hide their smirks, others looking concerned for Leo, who had always been treated like the golden child, the genius who never had to struggle. "Thank you, Leo," Mrs. Grant said, her voice measured. "Please return to your seat." Leo shuffled back to his desk, his heart heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that his world was unraveling. Was he really not the genius everyone said he was? Were the teachers right all along? The whispers from his classmates rang in his ears, adding to his confusion and self-doubt. The next day, Mrs. Grant sat down with the school administration to discuss Leo's situation. For months, she had suspected something wasn't right with the IQ test results. Leo's performance in class was dismal, far below the level of a supposed genius. His lack of focus, his struggles with even the most basic concepts, made it clear that the label he had been given was a farce. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. The school had finally requested the rerun of Leo's IQ test, and the results were nothing short of a shock. The original test results had been falsified. Leo's IQ wasn't exceptional, not by any means. In fact, his test scores barely registered above average, and his academic struggles in class now made sense. The administration and Mrs. Grant were concerned. Leo, despite the falsified records, was still in the gifted program, which was designed for students who demonstrated superior intelligence. The school had no choice but to take action. The parents, Leo's mother and father, were called in for a meeting. Mrs. Grant sat across from them, her hands folded neatly in front of her, while the administrators sat at the table, their faces grim. Mr. and Mrs. Wren, Mrs. Grant began, her voice calm but firm. We've reviewed the results of the rerun IQ test, and it's clear that Leo's scores are far below what we've been told. His performance in class is also not reflecting the expectations of the gifted program. There was a pause, and Leo's parents exchanged a look. They weren't surprised, but neither did they seem particularly disturbed by the news. We know you've had concerns about Leo's struggles, but we had hoped he would grow into the genius his test scores suggested, Mrs. Grant continued. Unfortunately, at this point, Leo's academic performance is not in line with the program's requirements. Unless there's improvement, we'll need to make adjustments. Leo's mother, always protective of her son, leaned forward, her expression defensive. You don't understand, she said, her voice shaking slightly. We only did this because we didn't want him to be mistreated. Leo has so much potential. We just didn't want him to face ridicule because of his academic struggles. We thought if the school knew he was a genius, they would give him the respect he deserves. But that doesn't excuse falsifying his IQ, Mrs. Grant replied, her tone softer now, though still stern. This kind of academic malpractice puts Leo in a difficult position. It's not fair to him, and it's not fair to the other students. Leo's father, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, spoke up. We just wanted to give him a chance to fit in, he said quietly. Maybe we went about it the wrong way, but we thought if the teachers and other students saw him as gifted, he wouldn't be bullied. He's special in his own way. The administrators exchanged glances before the principal spoke. We understand that you've acted out of love and concern, but we can't continue to allow this deception. Leo will need to take the necessary steps to prove his abilities, and if his performance doesn't improve, we'll have to consider moving him out of the gifted program. Despite their initial shock and disappointment, Leo's parents agreed to the terms. They knew they couldn't fight the truth. Over the next few weeks, Leo worked hard to keep up in class, though he struggled every step of the way. Mrs. Grant continued to monitor his progress closely, offering additional support where she could. Leo, though still a little unsure of himself, began to show signs of improvement. But the real breakthrough came one afternoon, when Mrs. Grant asked Leo to solve a simple fraction on the board, a task that had once seemed impossible to him. This time, Leo did it, slowly but surely, with care and precision. He solved the fraction, earning a nod of approval from Mrs. Grant. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. It was a start. Leo's parents never seemed too disturbed by the fiasco. They were just happy to see him trying. But for Leo, the lesson was clear. He didn't need to be a genius to fit in or prove his worth. Sometimes, all it took was determination and the willingness to try, even when the odds were stacked against him. As the year went on, Leo made slow but steady progress, no longer hiding behind a label of genius. He began to carve his own path, learning not just from the textbook, but from the people around him who believed in his potential, even when he didn't believe in it himself. The classroom was quiet, but there was a certain unease in the air. Mrs. Grant stood at the front, her arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She had been watching Leo closely for weeks, and today she had a plan. She knew that Leo had been struggling, but she didn't think it was out of laziness. No, she thought, it was more a matter of character. She decided that the best way to teach him a lesson about the importance of hard work would be to make an example of him. "Leo," Mrs. Grant called, her voice clear and commanding. "Come up to the board and solve this problem for the class." Leo's stomach turned. His heart began to race as he stood up and walked to the front of the classroom. His classmates were staring at him, some with curious eyes, others with barely contained smirks. They had all seen Leo's struggle before. He wasn't a genius, at least not the way his parents had claimed. And now, they were about to watch him fail. The problem on the board was simple, or so it seemed, a basic fraction. It was the kind of thing every 12-year-old should be able to solve easily. Leo stood in front of the board, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The numbers blurred together, and for a moment, he couldn't focus. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the chalk. The silence in the room was deafening. He could hear the whispers from the back of the class. "He's going to mess up," one of the kids muttered. "This is gonna be good," another one whispered. Leo glanced over at Mrs. Grant, whose expression was unreadable. She wasn't expecting him to succeed. Not really. The seconds ticked by, but Leo couldn't bring himself to write anything. His mind was a maze of self-doubt, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. He could hear the mocking whispers growing louder in his mind, and it was all he could do to keep his composure. But then something inside him shifted. It wasn't a loud voice, but a quiet one. A voice that told him to stop listening to the noise. A voice that reminded him of how far he had come, of the tiny victories he had achieved over the past few weeks. He wasn't a genius, but he could still try. He could still make progress, one step at a time. Taking a deep breath, Leo gripped the chalk and began to write. Slowly at first, but with more confidence as he worked through the fractions. Step by step, he solved the problem. It wasn't flawless, but it was right. By the time he finished, the room was still silent. For a moment, no one spoke. Leo stepped back from the board, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had done it. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. He could see Mrs. Grant staring at the board, her expression unchanged. But Leo could feel something shift in the air. There was a subtle recognition there, a flicker of acknowledgement that he wasn't the failure she had assumed. "Well," Mrs. Grant said after a long pause, her voice softer than usual. "That wasn't perfect, but it was an improvement. You've made progress, Leo. You have potential. You just need to focus." The words were not praise, but they weren't mockery either. Leo felt a small spark of hope rise within him. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe he wasn't as hopeless as he had once thought. Maybe he didn't have to live up to the expectations of being a genius. Maybe he could just be himself and work with what he had. Leo nodded, not sure what to say. He didn't respond verbally, but inside, he felt something begin to shift. He had worked hard to solve that problem. And though it wasn't perfect, it was real. It was his work, his effort. And that for now was enough. After class, Mrs. Grant asked him to stay behind for a moment. Leo felt his nerves return, but he stayed put, trying to calm himself. Mrs. Grant walked up to him, her face serious but not unkind. "Leo," she said, her voice more neutral than it had been before, "you're capable of so much more than you realize. But you need to focus. Don't hide behind your distractions. You're not the genius your parents said you were, but that doesn't mean you can't succeed. It's about hard work. Keep trying, and you'll get there." Leo looked up at her, surprised by the words. They weren't the harsh reprimands he had expected. Instead, they were an invitation, a quiet acknowledgement that he was on the right path, even if it wasn't a straight line. "Thank you," Leo muttered, not sure what else to say. It was the first time Mrs. Grant had spoken to him like this, without sarcasm or mockery. It felt good. It felt like a possibility. As Leo left the classroom, he didn't feel like the failure he had once believed himself to be. He wasn't a genius, and maybe he would never live up to his parents' expectations, but that was okay. He had made progress today, and that was enough for now. Walking down the hallway to his next class, Leo couldn't help but smile to himself. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe in himself, and that made all the difference. The weeks that followed were a quiet battle for Leo. Slowly but surely, his grades began to climb. It wasn't an instant transformation, but every small step forward felt like a victory. Leo started grasping concepts he had once found impossible. Simple fractions and basic algebraic equations no longer seemed like insurmountable obstacles. They still weren't easy, but they were manageable now. He could see the progress, even if it was a small amount. Mrs. Grant, though still tough, had begun to notice the change. She was no longer mocking him, nor was she expecting perfection. She had seen the effort Leo put into every assignment, the way he focused during every class, and how he no longer shied away from difficult problems. He wasn't a genius, but he was working hard, and that was enough in her eyes. "Leo," she said one day after class, "you're getting there. You're still behind, but you're catching up. Keep at it. Don't stop working, and you'll make it." Her words were far from extravagant praise, but they were a form of recognition that Leo hadn't received in a long time. He was starting to believe her. The fear and embarrassment that used to haunt him when he entered the classroom were fading. Instead, there was a quiet sense of pride growing inside him. He was doing it. Slowly, but surely, he was making progress. At home, however, things weren't as easy. Leo's parents continued to view him through the lens of the genius they had invented. Every time he struggled with something, they told him it was just a temporary setback, that he was special, and would catch up soon enough. They never questioned their decision to inflate his IQ test results. They didn't understand the pressure it had put on Leo, nor did they fully grasp the implications of their actions on his self-esteem. When Leo's report card came in with improved but still modest grades, his parents were disappointed, not in him, but in the system. "You're just not being challenged enough," his dad said as he sat Leo down at the kitchen table. "This school doesn't know how to handle you. You should be in a gifted program, not here." Leo nodded, but inside, a quiet voice began to rise. "I'm not a genius. I'm just doing my best. And that's enough." He had come to realize that he didn't need to live up to anyone else's expectations. His parents were well-meaning, but they were missing the point. He wasn't meant to be someone else's idea of success. He was meant to figure out what worked for him, at his own pace, in his own way. As Leo looked at the progress he had made, he realized something important. It wasn't about the label or the title of genius. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong or living up to a false identity. What mattered was the effort, the hard work he had put in, and the lessons he had learned along the way. He was proud of his progress, even if it wasn't dramatic, and that was enough for him. For the first time, Leo felt a sense of freedom. He didn't need to be the perfect student, the perfect son, or the perfect genius his parents had imagined. He didn't need to live up to anyone else's expectations but his own. He was learning and growing, and that was the most valuable thing of all. In the quiet moments of reflection, Leo felt at peace. He wasn't defined by a test score or a label. He was defined by his persistence, his effort, and his willingness to keep moving forward, no matter how slowly. And that was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Were Leo's parents truly acting out of love, or did their attempt to protect him only set him up for failure? Was their idea of helping really fair to him in the long run? Leo's journey is a powerful reminder that love isn't about living up to others' expectations. It's about accepting who we are and growing at our own pace. What do you think? Were they right, or did they miss the mark? If you enjoyed Leo's story, be sure to check out our previous series and dive into more emotional journeys that challenge how we view success, intelligence, and growth. Should I continue this series or explore other stories? Let me know in the comments. Thank you to everyone who watched. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with others. Your support means the world to us.